All right, good morning, class. Happy Thursday. You are almost through the week. Congratulations. Today we are going to continue our discussion of poetry. Um, we have a poem by Laurence Dunbar today called We Wear the Mask. This was written a long time ago, 1896, but I think it has great significance for us still today. You probably haven't heard of Paul Laurence Dunbar. Maybe you have if you're into poetry. Um, but he has a wonderful voice in poetry. One of the great things about poetry that I want you to appreciate is that it allows you to hear the voice of someone very different than yourself. First of all, there's a historical difference here. We're reading in 2020, and this poem was being read and was written in 1896. And so you have a 100-year gap. That's a historical difference. Another thing about history is that people had widely different experiences of history. So my grandfather was white in 1896, and lots of other people were black in 1896, and their experience of history would look vastly different, right? So Paul Laurence Dunbar was an African American living in America, and his experience of the late 1800s was not um, a cheery time for him to be a citizen. Um, so, for a little historical context, we have the Emancipation Proclamation, which is when Abraham Lincoln frees all of the slaves in 1862 or 1863. And that was a monumental change in America for the better, absolutely. But it didn't automatically fix things, of course. And there was still a wide racial gap in how citizens were treated in the United States. At least they were considered citizens now rather than slaves, but they were definitely what we would say second-hand citizens, meaning they didn't get all the freedoms and rights that white people did receive. Um, so that is something that happened in the 1860s. Now we're at 1896. Perhaps there's some changes, maybe, but a lot of the changes for the worse have just solidified or become part of the society. You might have heard of Jim Crow laws, which is where society was completely segregated into a whites only part of town and a blacks only part of town with certain facilities and entertainment options like theaters that certain people could use and other people couldn't use based off of their race. So it's still a very divided time in our nation. And why poetry is so important is that you can look into that time from a different voice, from the voice of an oppressed person and the voice of someone who's also finding strength in this time. I also thought it was just kind of interesting that the title is We Wear the Mask, which sounds very contemporary, meaning it sounds very, we're doing it a lot today, right? I wore a mask today. I went to go get some groceries at Aldi and I needed to put my mask on just to stay safe, it's wearing a mask is an interesting thing, right? Let's just talk about that for a second. When you put a mask on, what's the significance? When I have this over my face, you can't really see my emotion as well. Am I smiling? Am I frowning? You don't know if I'm smiling or frowning, and you can hardly hear me. It kind of muffles you. Um, so there's this kind of barrier that goes up when we put a mask on, and we have a secret self and a public self, right? Now there's two of us: the one that the world is seeing, and the true self, the true person behind the mask. Um, I'm going to stop commenting on this and just read the poem for you so we can get a sense of what you think. We Wear the Mask by Paul Laurence Dunbar. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs, Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but, O great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but, oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. So, there are many things that we could talk about with this poem, but one helpful place to start, I think, is asking who is the speaker? Who do we think is the one that's talking in this poem? And we want to avoid simply saying that the poet is the speaker, because oftentimes poets create characters that are saying things in their poems. Rather than just assuming it's Paul Laurence Dunbar's opinion, he can create a character. And what's interesting is it wouldn't even work if we assumed that Paul Laurence Dunbar was the speaker, because we have a plural. We, a plural subject. So who is the we? It would make sense, since we just talked about the historical context, to say that the we is African Americans in the 1890s, the Reconstruction era of the United States. And that would definitely work in how this poem reads. But it could be a lot of different people that could use this poem to understand their experiences afterwards, after the fact of 1896. Oftentimes marginalized groups of people could relate to this poem, feeling the need to have this mask on. So it has a lot of potential to be used in different ways. Other things that we could talk about with this poem, just to try to analyze it a little bit. This mask, the first thing we hear about it is that it grins and lies. So you have a picture of a mask that's always happy, right? It's grinning, it's smiling. Outwardly, it looks like everything's perfect with this person, or this group of people, I should say. And then there's the second part. It grins and lies at the same time, right? So it's portraying happiness, but that's not the truth about that person. So if the mask is grinning and lying, then it means that the person behind the mask is not grinning, is unhappy, deeply unhappy. The poet goes on to tell you more about that. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. You probably don't use the word guile every day, do you? Guile is like craftiness or sneakiness, even deception, something like that. That's what the word guile means. And when it says this debt we pay to human guile, this is a result of human craftiness. We have developed ways to live these kind of double lives where sometimes it's just necessary. When they use the word debt, that means that it's a necessary act to put on this mask. It's not something that they necessarily want to do, right? Whoever they represents in this poem. With torn and bleeding hearts, we smile. You're supposed to realize that distance is very far between what they are actually feeling and what they are showing. Torn and bleeding hearts. And mouth with myriad subtleties. We smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. So that's their presentation, right? What they are, how they are speaking, and how they are presenting themselves. The poet asks a rhetorical question in the second stanza. That's line 6. The second stanza is the middle one there. Why should the world be over wise in counting all our tears and sighs? Over wise, also an interesting phrase there. Overly wise, meaning why should they study our true expressions? Why should they study our true self beneath the mask in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, meaning no. Let them only see us while we wear the mask. It's almost like the poet is agreeing with the other people's ignorance, the outside group's ignorance of meaning their lack of knowledge of what this inside group is experiencing, saying, you're indifferent to us, you don't care about us. Um, but then the poet says, and you know what? You shouldn't. Or you should just, well, let's just keep it that way. There's kind of a bitterness there. Um, because there's actually some integrity and dignity. These are big words. I want to try to find an easier way to say this. There's actually some dignity in suffering with people alongside you, um, and not reaching out to an oppressor and trying to beg for them to understand you. There's actually some dignity in sharing within the circle of people being oppressed. Um, and suffering together in that. So the poet seems to be saying that at the end of stanza 2. Um, the outside group doesn't deserve to be led into their suffering. But it's a bit ironic, right? Because this poem has since the time of 1896 become extremely popular and actually offered outside groups a way into this, um, the emotional heart of this poet and his group. The third stanza, we smile, but O great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. This stanza is fascinating because on in the first two stanzas, the poet is addressing an audience that we can assume is a human audience, right? But then in the third stanza, this poem turns into a prayer. Um, in poetry, we call this an apostrophe. Yes, it's like the punctuation mark, but it's different. It means something else when we're talking about poetry, and it's where the speaker just addresses someone else all of a sudden, and in this case, it's God. We smile, but O great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile. The clay, that's like parts of the earth, right? Um, Elements of the earth. If you've ever played with clay like that, it's not something that grows in real lush areas. It's kind of where the work is hard and difficult. Beneath our feet and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. So they have a long journey ahead of them, this group of people that's speaking in this poem. They have, um, and like we talked about at the beginning of this lesson, they were freed from slavery, but now they are enchained with segregation and how they can't really move forward, or at least it's going to take a long time for society to change for the better. We have the civil rights movement in 1960s, but this is 1896, right? The road ahead is very long, and it's going to take time. And so in this journey, they're going to have to keep wearing this mask. Um, and that's kind of how they're going to have to get by, is the bleak outlook. But again, as we mentioned in stanza 2, why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. There's a sense in that the poet is saying, although this mask is not ideal and perfect, it's at least allowing us to empathize with one another in the midst of our troubles. And it gives them a source of empathy and dignity to their suffering. So again, poetry is powerful, right? It allows people to build this community, and it allows people outside of their community to understand them better. So when society is fractured or broken in a racialized way, then we need poetry to understand each other's voice, and that's extremely important. And it's not just important in 1896. It's important at all times, because society is never going to be just completely in harmony, right? Um, and so we need to keep listening to voices that are different than our own. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. Um, and yeah, tomorrow is Friday. We're going to have our meeting again. I want to get into rhyme scheme, how we can count rhymes together, and because that's something that's really important in poetry. You'll notice that there there is rhymes in this poem, of course, and it follows a certain pattern. And you can really discover a lot of things when you track with the rhyme scheme, meaning you follow what lines are rhyming with other ones. The best way I can advise you to do that is to use a highlighter in a Word document or a real piece of paper. Notice I've done some highlighting with this poem where you can see this green, everything in green rhymes with each other, and everything in yellow rhymes with each other, and blue. And it really makes it visually come alive when you can just locate that easily. Um, of course, there's a meter as well. This isn't a free verse poem. There is a rhythm to this poem. I want to see if you can gather that on your own for your question today. Can you figure out what the meter is? Perhaps you glimpsed it earlier, but um, I want to give you that opportunity to figure that out. So we'll talk more about rhyme in our meeting, and I hope you liked Paul Laurence Dunbar. See you guys later.